Hi, this is Josh Ford. I am the Associate Executive Director at the Washington, D.C. JCC. This is a talk I prepared for the Jewish Studies Center and delivered at Addis, Israel as part of their annual Latke-Hamantaschen debate. Being a Associate Exec at a JCC, a convener of community, I thought it was appropriate to get beyond the Latke-Hamantaschen conflict and see if we could do better. So, throughout history, the question of the Latke or the Hamantaschen has been viewed as a purely binary dispute that results in a zero-sum outcome. Either Latkes are superior and Hamantaschen inferior, or a vice versa absolutism that one could critique as Latke über alles. The source of this argument has its contemporary roots at the University of Chicago, which should immediately make us suspicious. It is natural that a school famous for its neoclassical economics and Milton Friedman would have us believe that the Latke and the Hamantaschen are natural competitors in the open market, that this competition benefits the consumer in the form of ever better quality products and optimal pricing for the market. In fact, the persistence of this conflict, like the persistence of all long-standing and seemingly intractable disagreements, should prod us to take a step back and ask, why? Why is the Latke seemingly in perpetual, unresolvable conflict with the Hamantaschen? At a number of levels, the conflict makes no sense. One is a cookie, clearly appropriate for dessert. The other, served hot, makes sense in any dining roll except for dessert. They don't compete for the same space on the culinary agenda. One is a starch, the other part grain, part fruit. One is angular, the other ovoid. One is savory, the other sweet. Were the Latke-Hamantaschen dispute not such a deeply ingrained and culturally mandated part of our discourse, one could propose that the whole idea were as ridiculous as debating the merits of the Boston Red Sox versus the Grateful Dead. What people can get pretty worked up on both sides of that argument, but it's not quite clear what they should be arguing about in the first place. I come to you tonight to say that this was not always the case, that there was a period where the Latke and the Hamantaschen dwelled in harmony. I will demonstrate that powerful interests sought to exploit a Latke-Hamantaschen schism for their own benefit. I will speak their names, and I will leave it to you to decide whether and how they should be held accountable. Finally, I will call for us to increase the peace, an end to the Latke-Hamantaschen hostilities, and a return to a more tolerant, pluralistic, gustatory culture. The first culprit to blame for the Latke-Hamantaschen conflict is Francisco Pizarro and the Spanish conquistadors. That's right, the potato was first domesticated in southern Peru sometime between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. When the Incans encountered the first Europeans in the New World during the 1500s, they traded their potatoes and in return got smallpox, syphilis, and a divisive civil war that weakened their empire to the point of total submission and collapse. Of course, I'm speaking of the battle between Tupac Cusi Hualpa and Atahualpa, the king's illegitimate son, who split on the manner of succession and whether applesauce or sour cream was the appropriate topping for an Incan human sacrifice. This early precursor of the Latke-Hamantaschen debate shows how destructive that these kinds of disputes can be to an entire civilization. The Spanish brought the potato back to Europe. During the height of the Inquisition, when it was embraced by Jewish conversos as well as those fleeing persecution, and subsequently traded along routes of Jewish commerce, arriving ultimately in Eastern Europe. When the spud arrived in the Jewish communities of Poland, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, the common understanding of what a Latke was had come from the south, evangelized by the Italian rabbi Colonimus ben Colonimus, who in the 13th century declared that latkes made from ricotta cheese were an excellent addition to celebrations of both Hanukkah and Purim. It only took a little while for the invasive species of potato to begin to turn the tide of latke culture in its favor. By the time of massive crop failures in the 1800s, the uni-holiday potato latke of Hanukkah had completely supplanted the multi-holiday cheese-based latke. And what of the Hamantaschen? Well, it's no coincidence that they enter the historical record at around the same time that Pizarro was bringing potatoes and yellow fever back to Europe. Curiously, the first mention of them comes from an Italian Purimspiel written by Yehuda Somo in the 16th century, where the cookie is referred to by its Hebrew name, Oznei Haman, or Haman's ear. This gives both the latke and the Hamantaschen an Italian provenance within 200 years of each other. And it would appear, for much of that early history, the Hamantaschen and the latke were able to coexist peacefully. Ironically, perhaps, it was in the midst of anti-Semitic inquisitions throughout Europe that latkes and Hamantaschen found common ground as the foodstuffs of religious festivals celebrating Jewish power fantasies. When you're afraid of being burned at the stake, you don't waste too much effort advocating for fried foods versus baked goods. To the extent that Hamantaschen concerned themselves with disputes of any kind, they were of the more internecine variety, consisting of the ongoing debate between the fruits and the seeds. The seed camp were originalists who believed that poppy seeds and only poppy seeds were the proper filling for Hamantaschen. Buttressing that argument is the linguistic similarity between the Yiddish Montaschen, meaning pocket of seeds, which was modified to fit the name of Purim's villain, Haman. Meanwhile, the fruits camp insisted on a prune filling on the insistence that every Jewish holiday must have a little suffering involved. Either way, they were entirely unconcerned with latkes. So, what ended this détente? We don't have time to truly go into depth about it here, but it begins with the conclusion of Italian unification in 1871 and the settlement of the Roman question, industrialization, the creation of the Standard Oil Trust, and its subsequent dissolution, the battle between Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla to determine whether alternating or direct current would become the standard of electrification, the temperance movement, and the commercial introduction of sliced Wonder Bread in the 1930s. All of this is well known. But the real question is, who benefits most from the Latke-Hamantaschen divide? Allow me to introduce you to the Idaho Fruit and Vegetable Advertising Commission, founded in 1937 and better known today as the Idaho Potato Commission, and Sunsweet Growers, Incorporated, founded in 1912 as the California Prune and Apricot Growers Association. The Idaho potato, of course, is the best-selling potato brand in the world, and Sunsweet Growers controls 2/3 of the global prune market. At a top-secret meeting in 1948, representatives from Big Spud and Power Prunes met in an abandoned Air Force base in the Nevada desert. There, in a deal brokered by an extraterrestrial, who would end up serving as Secretary of Agriculture under President Eisenhower, the Latke-Hamantaschen debate was born. The plan had several key advantages. First, it would increase the sales of both prunes and potatoes, as loyalists for each side would seek to prove the supremacy of their Jewish power fantasy holiday food of choice. Second, it would exacerbate splits in the Jewish community that were becoming apparent in the aftermath of the creation of the State of Israel. At a time when the Reform movement had yet to embrace Zionism, and Orthodox Jews viewed with suspicion a secular Israeli state, the additional friction of Hamantaschen versus Latke played right into the hands of our enemies. Third, it would make possible an emerging Cold War strategy of containment. Were the delicate balance of terror between prunes and fried foods thrown out of balance, the entire world could be subjected to gastrointestinal chaos. And so the strategy of division has continued to this day. It has proved to be a rather nimble tactic over time, adapting to changing conditions and geopolitical shifts. Most recently, we have seen the divisive impact of the Latke-Hamantaschen debate sublimated into the ongoing disputes between advocates for J Street and activists for AIPAC, Giants versus Patriots, Daily Show versus Colbert Report, Rehoboth or Dewey Beach, Santorum or Romney. The result being an ever more divided and fractious Jewish people. Tonight, I come here to implore us all to move beyond these conflicts which blind us to our true interest, which is Jewish unity. Without the solidarity of Esther and Mordecai and the Maccabee brothers, Jews surely would not have survived as a people for as long as we have. Let us return to that pre-Columbian state where latkes and Hamantaschen not only coexisted, but shared festive occasions. Let us return to the cheese-based latkes and savory Hamantaschen, just as Rabbi Kalonymus ben Kalonymus would want us to. In conclusion, I'd like to thank the organizers at the Jewish Studies Center for inviting me to participate in this important symposium, and most importantly, I'd like to thank the benefactor that provided me with a generous research grant and ample materials to prove my argument, the dairy farmers of America. Thank you very much.